Another weekly live with yours truly, Dr. Sarah Webb. Let's see if we get a preview from Instagram here. All right, so Instagram's not working again, which means I will pull out my phone. So this week's live is called Beyond the Binary, Understanding Colorism as a Spectrum of Privilege. I'm ready to jump into this topic with you all. As always, feel free to say hello in the chat. Let me know where you're tuning in from. And I will be saving time for questions at the end, if you have any. Let's get rid of that. Okay. All right. There we go. So now we're live on all of our platforms. So in terms of thinking about colorism beyond the binary, yes, feel free to say hello in the chat on Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn. There is a big difference between colorism and racism, in that colorism really highlights for us that privilege is a spectrum, right? And that on a micro scale, our privilege and how we experience our identities and how we experience our bodies can be contextual. So it's not all or nothing. A lot of times people want to talk about privilege as if it's all or nothing. Either you have all the privilege you could possibly have in the world, or you have zero privilege, right? And that goes into arguments around how, cis white men can struggle too, or they have problems too. And so it's not about whether or not a person has problems or whether or not their life is quote unquote perfect. We can still see ourselves relative to people who might have more, and also relative to people who might have less access or privilege and or discrimination and marginalization. And when it comes to something like colorism, we might also remember that when we consider the global range of human skin tones, many people find that in one context, they have the lightest skin tone. And then in a separate context, that same person might have the darkest skin tone, right? And many humans across the globe often find themselves somewhere in the middle, somewhere along that spectrum, right? And so when we think about the spectrum of privilege, it's not always the binary of you're either light and you are always seen as light no matter where you go in the world. And it's not always, you're dark skinned and you're always perceived or labeled as dark skinned no matter where you go in the world, right? So if you're just tuning in, if you're new to Colorism Healing, I am Dr. Sarah Webb, the founder of Colorism Healing. And this is an ongoing series based on my new PDF/ebook called Corporate Colorism: Why Business Leaders Must Upgrade Their Anti-Racist Strategies. So we're talking about a very important piece of why a lot of common approaches to racial equity work and why a lot of common approaches to anti-racism work are incomplete, right? And not as efficient or effective as they could be. And one of those is missing or failing to address colorism and the fact that not everyone who identifies the same racially will have the same experience of racism. Okay, so that's super, super important to consider. Also, I will be taking questions at the end, but you're free to comment in the chat along the way. And thinking about examples of privilege as a spectrum, a lot of the research actually does break down different levels of skin tone, right? So a lot of the research does not just categorize people as either light or dark, right? A lot of the research actually says, people with very light skin tones, people with light skin tones, people with medium brown skin tones, people with dark skin tones, and people with very dark skin tones, right? So we've even seen in the research over the past decades that researchers are acknowledging that it very much is a spectrum of privilege, and that the degree of lightness or the degree of darkness in someone's skin tone does have consequential outcomes for their lives, right? So there are a couple of studies I wanted to pull up. There are more that I wanted to pull up, but I didn't have time to translate all the data into charts. And if you're on Instagram, you won't be able to see this, but if you really want to see the charts that I'm about to pull up for yourselves, you could always go back and watch it on YouTube. But for my folks on YouTube and LinkedIn, this first chart I'm going to pull up, you might have already seen. It's the Catalyst report. And I'm really thankful that not only they did the report, but that they also were able to illustrate it, right? Give us a visual representation of how it's not just, light versus dark, but being a little bit lighter than someone else can still put you ahead in terms of social access, in terms of how much opportunity and privilege you have in a particular context. And being a few shades darker than someone, even if you're not very, very dark skinned, being a few shades darker than someone can still exacerbate the degree to which you experience racism at work or racism in school, right? There's another one, another research study that I did have time to create a chart of, and that's the marriage rates. And so looking at how those researchers, when they were studying marriage rates for African American women, they broke it down to dark-skinned women, women with medium skin tones, and women with light skin tones. And they also included white women in general as a whole in that category. And so you can see that there are degrees and levels of discrimination. So for my folks on Instagram who can't see the chart, the likelihood of marriage before age 30 for light-skinned Black women was 55%. And for white women, it was 50%. For Black women with medium skin tones, it was 30%. And for dark-skinned Black women, it was 23%, right? And so we see a range of skin tones. Even though we all identify as Black women, we're not all getting married at the same rates. Even though we all identify as Black women or women of color, we're not all experiencing racism to the same degree or in the same ways, okay? And then I also want us to think about how we bridge the micro to the macro. So understanding this spectrum of privilege, that there are different tiers of privilege that we might experience depending on how light people perceive our skin to be or how dark people perceive our skin to be, is that we have to always bridge the micro to the macro, right? It's really hard to have one without the other. And I'm saying this because you'll have a lot of people who maybe are medium brown or they are typically considered lighter skinned, but they grew up as the darkest skinned person in their family, or they grew up as the darkest skinned person in their school or in their local community. And so while they might have been discriminated against for not being light enough, right? That's also a phrase I want us to consider, right? Like, I'm considered light skinned, but when I go to the UK, when I marry into the royal family, I'm not light enough, right? And so even though you might have had those experiences, those micro level experiences, you have to bridge that to the global context in which you are still considered very light-skinned, right? And so a lot of times what I hope is for people who are kind of medium brown or lighter skin, who have often experienced not being quote unquote light enough, is that you're able to use that to help you develop compassion and empathy for your darker skinned siblings, for your darker skinned brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, uncles, right? And seeing how if you experience that being as light as you are, then hopefully it helps you to imagine and to bridge the gap to understand the degree of oppression and marginalization that those with very dark skin tones might be experiencing, right? So what I hope we can avoid is someone with a medium brown skin tone, for example, who was told that they weren't light enough or who didn't quite pass the paper bag test, right? Like maybe they're not seen as dark skinned, but they didn't pass that paper bag test. Still seeing that while you were kept out of that opportunity or kept out of that room or barred from having access to that financial capital or that upward social mobility, that it helps you translate your experience to have empathy, compassion, understanding for the degrees and levels of marginalization and discrimination that people who are unequivocally considered dark-skinned, right? Because there are people who are in every context will be viewed as dark-skinned, right? And there are people who in every context, no matter what room they walk into, they will be considered light-skinned. And so thinking about, yes, you don't have to be the most privileged person to have privilege. And yes, you don't have to be the most marginalized person to have marginalization. But we should always be conscious of not just the micro experience in that moment, not just me in my individual workplace, but if we were to have a global meeting and have a global roundtable of people of all skin tones, which side of the spectrum do we fall on, right? And then last week I talked about the line analogy. I'm calling it the pastry line analogy. I speak in analogies for those of you who are just getting familiar with my work. And so if you weren't here last week, or if you didn't see last week's content, I want to kind of just reiterate the pastry line analogy. So if we're all standing in line for donuts and we have 100 people in line ready to get their choice of donuts, there's an assortment of donuts, sprinkles, filling, cream cheese, cherry filling, all the kinds of donuts you can imagine. And there are 100 people in line for 99 donuts, right? Because, and I'm saying this, I'm using this analogy because you will often have people say, in fact, the very first time I blogged about colorism, there was a lighter skinned Black woman who was upset and angry with me for talking about colorism. And she was saying how it doesn't matter because we're all just fighting for crumbs anyway. And I have to disagree with that. And I think the pastry line analogy is a good response to that. It's like, no, we're not all fighting for crumbs. Even if you're not number 1 in line, if you're number 50, you still get a donut. If you're number 75, you will still get a donut, right? If there are 99 donuts, the only person who's really fighting for crumbs would be the very last person in line. So let's not make the assumption that just because we're not number 1 in line, that we're just all scrambling for crumbs, because that's simply not the case. And I will say that the closer you are to the front, not only are you guaranteed a donut, but you're guaranteed your choice of donuts, right? And so it's not just, oh, well, you get something, but the further you are to the front of that donut line, the more options you have, the more opportunities you have to get your precise favorite donut, right? And so if you're 98 in line, you're going to get a donut, but you don't have the array of opportunities. You don't have the array of options at your disposal that the person who was number 2 or number 3 in line had, right? And so again, we all have to be accountable for where we stand in line. And if you are like me, you don't just want your own special donut. You want everybody to be able to get their donut, right? And so thinking about larger systems like capitalism that teach us scarcity and that there aren't enough resources to go around, I think there are other paradigm shifts that we have to consider. But given the way our current society is set up and structured, people hoard resources and they hoard wealth and they hoard opportunities, which is why it often feels like there aren't enough for everyone to go around. And then the last thing I'll say before I move to questions, I haven't been reading your comments yet because I'm dealing with like 3 different screens. And so it's hard to like go back from my notes to the questions and then back to my notes. So I'm just going to go finish off my notes here before I bring in your questions and your comments, because I know they are always fire and on point. When we think about intersectionality, that adds dimension to the conversation around colorism. And so it's possible for a dark-skinned Black woman like me to earn more income than a light-skinned woman. It's possible for me to get married before a light-skinned woman gets married. It's possible for me to have more career success or more public recognition and accolades than a light-skinned woman, right? But here's the thing. So instead of taking that case or that instance to say, oh, well, see, colorism isn't real, Dr. Webb, because you make more money than this light-skinned woman, or you got married before this light-skinned woman, right? And ask the question, right? If you ever doubt whether or not the color hierarchy persists in a given situation, ask the question, yes, let's say I have more career success than a light-skinned woman. Ask the question, but if Dr. Webb were light-skinned with long, straight hair, might she have garnered even more career success with less struggle, right? And on the flip side, if there's a light-skinned woman who is struggling, who is down on her luck, or who is not getting the life outcome she wants, ask the question, if that same person, all other things being equal, if that same person were dark-skinned, would they have faced even greater hurdles? Would they have faced even greater obstacles, right? And given what we know about the research on colorism, the answer is yes. More than likely, that would be true. And so we're not looking at privilege as, a lot of white people respond to white privilege by saying, well, I grew up poorer than you did, or you grew up middle class and I grew up, working class. That might be the case, right? Like a white person could be homeless. That is true. And there are Black people who are not homeless. There are indigenous people who are not homeless. while that white person might be down on their luck, they might have struggled to get a job. What the research shows us is that if they were Black or indigenous, right, or brown skinned or an immigrant, they would have a harder time getting a job than they currently have as a white person. So that's how we have to understand privilege. Not that nothing ever goes wrong for you. Not that you get to design your life and have a completely unimpeded path towards your ideals. That's not what we talk about when we talk about privilege. Is all things being the same, would it have been easier for you if you had light-skinned? All things being the same, would you have had more struggles and more obstacles if you had been darker skinned, right? So those are some questions we can ask ourselves. And with that, I'm going to now turn to questions and comments. Let's see, I have a lot to catch up on, I'm sure. So bear with me. Hey, Michael, always good to see you. Hey, Fatia, how are you? If you're on LinkedIn, Fatia, I'm doing a live with Fatia on Saturday. So be sure to check out her page so you can see that. Michael says, yeah, Meghan Markle was light-skinned, but not right-skinned. Right. I was about to come get you, Aya. Let's see. Jamila Simmons says, research has proven women of darker skin tones are less likely to receive promotion and are elected for positions that lighter skinned women and white or elected to positions than lighter skinned women and white women. Yes, thank you, Jamila Simmons, for adding that in the chat. Hi, Fern. Welcome. If you're missing anything, these are all saved for playback later on, so you can go back and watch from the beginning. All right, Instagram. Let me show y'all some love over here. See if you all have questions or comments that I can respond to. I definitely saw some comments coming through. Bought the first badge. Don't forget to thank them. Oh, Kat Rivers. Hey. Oh, thank you, Kat Rivers, for the badge. I didn't know I had badges turned on. I used to have to manually turn on badges, but I guess it's automatic now for Instagram. So thank you for supporting the work. Let's see. Life is complex. I definitely have light skin privilege and get told I'm not dark enough as well as not light enough. It's weird, but that makes me want to help my people of all colors or that are harmed by society. Yeah, so life is complex, and what an appropriate screen name for this topic, right? I also have felt that way, and my struggles, the things I have endured, make me more compassionate for other people, right? It's because I have experienced certain types of discrimination and bullying and marginalization that I do want more for everyone. They say hurt people, but sometimes hurt people heal people. And that's kind of the route I've chosen to take. Got to acknowledge the context, intersectionality that makes different levels within oppression. Yes, Janelle Crutch says, good example of standing in the line. Hate when they run out of my option by the time I got to the front. Right. And I know it might sound like a trivial example compared to like oppression and systems of violence, but I think it's an accessible analogy, right? Because it's an experience that many people have had in terms of standing in a line. And even if you get a donut, like you got there and like you barely got it versus the first person in line. You know, the first person in line, not only do they get their pick of the donuts, but they take the longest time to pick the donut. So there are degrees of privilege, right? Like they're breathing over the donuts. They might even touch a few of the donuts. And so, yeah, really the closer you are to the front of that line, the more access you have, the more opportunities, the more options you have. And the further to the back of the social hierarchy you are, your opportunities and options become drastically limited. Oh, thanks for the badge, Jandel Crutch, also in there. So good. Relating it to white privilege makes it so plain. Yes, because what we often say about colorism is that a lot of our lighter skinned siblings revert to the same tactics that white people use to deny racism, right? Or to shut down conversations around racism. We very often see lighter skinned people and sometimes even brown skinned people saying, well, I am a light-skinned woman and I'm still unmarried. I've never been married. So, dismiss that research study, right? Or I'm a light-skinned person and I don't make as much as this person. So dismiss that research study. And it's like, no, the research still stands. And what you can acknowledge is that even though you might not make all the money you hope to make, you're still 99% likely to make more than you would if you were darker skinned. Weeda Face says it wasn't even about Meg. It was about her mother. The grandparents were worried all their inbreeding was going to go to waste. This is true. Yes, this is where part of where that one drop rule comes from. Says, ooh, sometimes hurt people heal people. Bars. I like to think I got bars. Jandel. I like to think I have bars. Okay, so if there are no more questions or comments, I'm going to wrap up. Let's see. Oh, Life is Complex says persons in the front get the freshest donuts too. See, good point. They get the freshest donuts. All right. So again, because I'm not sure where people are tuning in at, this has been a conversation about moving beyond the binary and how it's not just this one frame of reference for what light-skinned is, and there's not just this one frame of reference for what dark-skinned is. And regardless of where we fall on that spectrum, light brown or dark brown or light or very light, we have to be accountable for where we are positioned in various social systems. So that's my biggest takeaway. And my homework for you all is to place yourself in the pastry line. Based on your skin tone, where are you in the pastry line? Are you number one in that line? Are you directly in the middle of that line? Are you at the very end of that line? Do some self-reflection, because it's so easy. And I speak to myself too. I speak to, cisgendered women. Like, I speak to all of my identities as well. It's so easy to focus on the ways that we are oppressed. And a lot of times we miss the ways that we are privileged, right? And that's one of the characteristics of being privileged, is that we often get to be oblivious of these things. And so let's do some self-reflection. Try not to be oblivious. Try to self-reflect on not just our marginalization, but how we might also simultaneously be privileged in some ways relative to people who are more marginalized. And so your affirmation then is that I am accountable for my position in the pastry line. And of course, we're all advocating and pushing for everyone to not just be in a pastry line. We want everyone to have access to the bakery, right? We want to multiply the bakeries. We don't want just someone doling out donuts. We want to be able to place our order for our donuts and know that because we have direct access to the bakery itself, that everybody is good. You know what I mean? That's where we're headed. That's what we're fighting for. Next week, same time, same place. I'll be doing a lecture on the 2 different types of colorism. I've done a video on this before, but I'll be updating it. And of course, I'll be doing it live. So that's always fun. And we'll talk about intra-racial colorism and interracial colorism and why it's so important to know the difference and to acknowledge the difference. Again, this is part of a longer series based on my brief text called Corporate Colorism and Why Business Leaders Must Upgrade Their Anti-Racist Strategies. I think I see one last question coming in from LinkedIn. Candace Bell says, I'm dark-skinned, but I sometimes think people in my Black community believe I am privileged because I come from a 2-parent home with parents who are PhD educated. I would agree with you that if I were light-skinned, I would probably not be treated negatively for the alleged privilege, according to your theory. Is that what you are arguing? Well, part of what I'm arguing is that with something like colorism, it's very easy to say, oh, well, you have a PhD or your parents have a PhD. But when you're entering a space, especially when it comes to education levels, when you're entering a space, people can't see your PhD, right? As someone who also has a PhD, what I've seen in terms of colorism experiences and general racism experiences is that people don't see my parents. If I'm showing up to a job interview, I'm not going to say, oh, by the way, my parents have PhDs, right? And so colorism is a lot about what we talk about profiling. We talk about racial profiling. Well, there's color-based profiling as well. And so if you're lighter skinned, you don't have to deal with that perception, right? A lot of light-skinned people are more likely to be believed as intelligent or perceived as intelligent regardless of their actual level of education or regardless of their actual IQ or test scores. So there have been research studies that shown in job interviews that potential employers favored or saw light-skinned candidates as more fit for the job, even if they didn't have higher education, more qualifications, or more work experience, right? They were more likely to pick the lighter skinned person. And the research study shows, at least one of them showed, that skin tone made a bigger difference in hiring decisions than education or levels of experience, right? And so thinking about colorism, especially because of the visual bias, when someone sees me, they see a dark-skinned woman with an afro. They don't see a PhD unless they already know me. If they already know who I am, then sure, they might say, oh, that's Dr. Webb. I'm going to defer to her on terms of this research or this, discussion. But when I'm going to the grocery store, if I am, walking into a meeting or a conference, if I'm presenting at an event, if I'm going to speak at an event, it's right. Most people are like, oh, that's what you look like. Or, oh, are you the speaker? Oh, you're the professor, right? And so there's a level of protection that the visual perception gives you versus something like your education levels. Class is similar. The only thing about class privilege is that sometimes you can signal class privilege with things like clothes or handbags or shoes or the cars you drive. So sometimes you can signal privilege, class privilege in ways that you can't really signal educational privilege always, right? And so a lot of it, when we talk about entering into a space where no one knows your name, all they're going on is what they see. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Candace. That was a great question. And thank you for sharing part of your lived experience with that. All right, folks. Oh, we're good on time. So let me get a few more questions here. This is Francois Foster on Instagram. I recently watched Dark Girls and Light Girls and didn't understand why they didn't share that light-skinned people think they experience colorism. Don't experience colorism. So I had this discussion on a panel on colorism in Hollywood on Thursday. Thinking about the social systems, systemic hierarchies, they don't go in reverse. And so a lot of people relegate colorism to bullying, right? Or you're being mean to someone. And so there are people who are mean to light-skinned people, right? That is getting bullied, that is being teased, or people just not liking you, right? But that does not equate to an entire social system that marginalizes light-skinned people. And so light-skinned people don't experience colorism because they are not systemically marginalized because of their skin tone. They're not structurally oppressed. They're not institutionally oppressed and marginalized and discriminated against, relegated from opportunities, given limited access to social capital because of their skin tone, right? And so we have to elevate conversations about colorism to the systemic level, to the structural level. And more importantly, what I often have to say is that what light-skinned people describe when they say they experience colorism, or what light-skinned people are describing when they say they experience quote-unquote reverse colorism, is often a response to their privilege. It's often a response to the fact that they benefit from a system that perpetuates violence and oppression against dark-skinned people. And then the third thing I'll say is that light-skinned people, especially light-skinned Black people, but light-skinned people in all cultures really, now that I'm saying it, light-skinned people across the globe have actively participated in that system of discrimination and marginalization against dark-skinned people. Because a lot of times when I hear conversations around, oh, well, the dark-skinned girls didn't like me, or dark-skinned girls were mean to me, or they pulled my hair, there's this assumption of light-skinned innocence. I just want to pause on that for a moment. And that conversation plays into systemic colorism. The assumption of light-skinned innocence, the assumption that there couldn't be any possible reason that these light-skinned girls might be experiencing backlash. There couldn't be any possible reason that these light-skinned people might be distrusted in their community. There's no fathomable reason why dark-skinned people want to have safe spaces away from light-skinned people, right? Because there very much is a fathomable reason. And that is because many, many communities of light-skinned people have actively hoarded opportunities, have actively discriminated against darker-skinned people of the same race by not hiring them into their jobs, not allowing them into their churches, not allowing them into their social organizations, not allowing them into their, what was the other one I was going to say? Jobs. I think I might have said that. And, their neighborhoods, right? So having neighborhoods where only wealthy light-skinned people can have ownership here. And so light-skinned people do not experience colorism in the way that they often try to say it, right? Now, what I say is, for those people who are told they're not light enough, that is a form of colorism, right? If you are technically light-skinned, but you're darker than, I don't know, say a Zendaya, right? And so people prefer Zendaya over you because you're not light enough. That is a form of colorism because you're not light enough. We need the lightest, and any type of darkness, like you're getting too dark. You're not dark, but you're getting close to dark, right? Like that can be a type of colorism. But a lot of times they're talking about it as in, dark-skinned people were mean to light-skinned people. And that's not colorism. More often than not, it's that dark person's perception or response to the fact that this person or people like this person benefit from my oppression and my marginalization. All right? Yeah, there's this, because on Thursday we had this question come up during the panel, and there's always this feigning of complete innocence. And I think in order to repair the relationships between dark-skinned people and light-skinned people, especially women, I think in order to repair our sisterhoods across the color spectrum, we need our more privileged sisters to 100% stand in the fact that they are privileged and not try to equate their experiences with ours, because that fuels the distrust. And so any light-skinned person listening, if you aren't just unequivocally acknowledging that you are privileged, that colorism is a systemic problem that marginalizes and commits violence and stigma against dark-skinned people, like if you're not standing in that fact, that reality, then dark-skinned people don't owe you trust. Dark-skinned people don't owe you our friendship. Dark-skinned women don't owe you our sisterhood, right? That's the other thing too. I know I'm going beyond like my topic for today, but light-skinned people are not entitled to being my friend, right? Light-skinned people are not entitled to my quote unquote kindness, right? And there's this sort of entitlement that everyone should treat me, as if I am on a red carpet. And that's just not the case. People aren't going to always like me for whatever reason. And they are entitled to that. But especially people who are more marginalized than I am. If a plus size woman rolls her eyes at me and says, "You think you all that, you skinny bitch," I am okay with that. I will move on with my life and I will continue to advocate for intersectional liberation for all people, right? I'm not going to equate that to reverse sizeism. I would never say that. If a trans woman rolls her eyes at me and says, "You can't eat lunch with me because I don't like you," that's fine. She is entitled to that. I, as the cisgendered person, am not entitled to acceptance or friendship from trans women who might feel or have, harmful experiences triggered by my presence. And I'm not going to say, that's reverse sexism, right? Or reverse, I don't know what the correct term would be for that, but that's not reverse transphobia, right? Or that's not reverse gender phobia. It's just not. And so I'll leave it at that. It is a tough truth. Yes, tough truths. But yeah. All right, folks, I love you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for engaging in this conversation. If someone needs to hear this, please share this video with them, and I'll see y'all next week, same place, same time, for an expanded conversation about colorism, looking at two different types of colorism: the colorism that happens amongst us, people of the same race, and the colorism that happens across people of different races. All right? Much love. Mwah.